The ignored voice. The waiting room at Crestview General Hospital hummed with the familiar rhythm of late evening chaos. The faint beep of monitors, muffled conversations, and the occasional echo of hurried footsteps melded into a soundtrack of urgency and exhaustion. The stereo lights overhead cast a pale glow, bright but strangely devoid of warmth. Among the sea of weary faces, Tasha Baker sat clutching her chest, her breaths shallow and ragged. Her arrival had gone largely unnoticed. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes and a practiced smile, glanced up briefly when Tasha approached the desk. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite but distant. I think I'm having a heart attack," Tasha managed to say, her voice trembling under the weight of her fear. The receptionist raised an eyebrow, her fingers pausing mid-typing. She looked Tasha over, her dark skin glistening with sweat, the slight tremor in her hands. "Have you had anxiety before?" she asked, the question landing with a thud in the heavy air between them. Tasha blinked, momentarily stunned by the implication. "No, this isn't anxiety. My chest, it's like something's crushing it." The receptionist nodded slowly, typing a few words into the computer before handing Tasha the clipboard. "Fill this out, and we'll call you when we can." Tasha took the clipboard, her fingers trembling as she filled in her information. Each second felt heavier than the last, the pain in her chest growing sharper. By the time she handed the clipboard back, she felt faint, her legs threatening to give way. But no one seemed to notice. 10 minutes later, Tasha was seated on the edge of a cold examination table, her breaths shallow and uneven. Nurse Paula Hill entered the room, her expression softening, as she took in Tasha's pale face and trembling hands. "Let's get your vitals," Paula said gently, wrapping a blood pressure cuff around Tasha's arm. The numbers flashed on the monitor, and Paula frowned. "Your blood pressure is high," she murmured, more to herself than to Tasha. Tasha nodded weakly, her hand pressing against her chest. "It's getting worse," she whispered. Paula hesitated, glancing at the chart. "I'll let Dr. Adams know," she said before stepping out of the room. Dr. Roger Adams arrived moments later, his white coat pristine, his clipboard tucked under one arm. His presence filled the small room with an air of authority, but his eyes barely glanced at Tasha as he reviewed her chart. "Chest pain?" he asked briskly. Tasha nodded. "It's like something heavy is sitting on my chest." Dr. Adams hummed noncommittally, scribbling a note. "Have you been under stress lately? Feeling anxious?" "No," Tasha said, frustration creeping into her voice. "This isn't stress. It's real pain." Dr. Adams sighed, his tone shifting to one of practiced patience. "Sometimes anxiety can mimic heart attack symptoms. I'll prescribe you something to help you relax." Tasha's eyes widened. "But—" "It's late," Dr. Adams interrupted, already heading for the door. "Follow up with your primary care doctor if the symptoms persist." And then he was gone, leaving Tasha alone with the echo of her unspoken plea. Paula stood just outside the room, her jaw tight as she watched Dr. Adams move on to the next patient. She had seen this before, the quiet dismissal, the subtle shift in tone reserved for certain patients. Her fingers curled around the edge of the clipboard as she debated what to do. Inside the room, Tasha fought back tears. She had come seeking help, only to be brushed aside as though her pain was insignificant. The ache in her chest throbbed with a rhythm that felt dangerously unfamiliar. She thought about leaving, but the idea of walking out without answers made her stomach churn. 7 minutes later, alarms blared down the hallway. Paula turned toward the sound, her heart sinking as she recognized the room it came from. She bolted inside to find Tasha slumped on the bed, her breathing shallow, her skin a terrifying shade of gray. "Code blue," Paula shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. Nurses and doctors rushed into the room, the hum of machinery giving way to the urgent commands of the resuscitation team. Dr. Adams appeared in the doorway, his face pale as he took in the scene. For the first time, his carefully constructed demeanor cracked. "What happened?" he demanded, but no one answered. The truth was glaringly obvious. As the team worked to stabilize Tasha, another figure stepped into the room. Dr. Elaine Carter, the head of emergency medicine. Her sharp gaze swept over the scene before landing on Dr. Adams. "We need to talk," she said, her voice low but firm. Dr. Adams hesitated, then followed her out of the room. In the hallway, Dr. Carter turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You dismissed her," she said bluntly. "I didn't think it was serious," Dr. Adams began, but Dr. Carter held up a hand. "You didn't think," she interrupted. "That's the problem. You assumed." Dr. Adams opened his mouth to argue, but the words died on his lips. Dr. Carter's stare bore into him, leaving no room for excuses. "This isn't just about you," she continued. "This is about the system that allows this to happen. And it ends now." Back in the room, Tasha's condition stabilized, though her road to recovery would be long. Paula stayed by her side, her hand resting lightly on Tasha's as the chaos around them began to settle. "You're going to be okay," Paula said softly, her voice filled with quiet determination. Tasha met her gaze, a flicker of gratitude breaking through the fear. "Thank you," she whispered. As the night wore on, the hospital returned to its usual rhythm. But for Tasha, Paula, and Dr. Carter, the events of that evening would leave a lasting mark. A reminder of the silent battles fought every day, and the voices that refused to be ignored. The weight of silence. Tasha Freeman lay motionless in her hospital bed, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The thin hospital gown clung to her damp skin, and her heart monitor beeped steadily, each sound a reminder of how close she had come to losing her life. The cold fluorescent lights overhead felt oppressive, but she barely noticed them. Her mind was clouded with exhaustion and a growing sense of disbelief. Paula Hill, the nurse who had been by Tasha's side throughout the chaos, lingered by the door. She was supposed to be attending to other patients, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. She couldn't bring herself to leave. The image of Tasha gasping for air while alarms blared haunted her. Dr. Elaine Carter, head of emergency medicine, had just left the room after a tense exchange with Dr. Adams. Paula had overheard parts of it, and though Dr. Adams had tried to defend himself, the truth was evident. He had dismissed Tasha's symptoms. Paula's grip on the clipboard tightened as she recalled the moment. It wasn't the first time she had seen this happen, but it felt different this time. More urgent, more unforgivable. Meanwhile, in the hospital's administrative wing, Dr. Carter stood in her office, reviewing Tasha's chart. The words blurred together as frustration bubbled beneath her calm exterior. She had seen these patterns before. Subtle biases, unconscious or not, that determined which patients were taken seriously and which were dismissed. Dr. Carter tapped her pen against the desk, her mind racing. She thought about the last time something like this happened. A middle-aged black man whose chest pain had been dismissed as indigestion, only for him to collapse in the parking lot minutes later. He hadn't survived. The memory weighed heavily on her, driving her resolve to confront the systemic issues that allowed these tragedies to unfold. Back in Tasha's room, she stirred awake, her eyes fluttering open to find Paula still standing nearby. "You're still here," Tasha said weakly, her voice barely audible. Paula nodded. "I wanted to make sure you were okay." Tasha managed a faint smile. "Thank you for believing me. It feels like that doesn't happen often." Paula hesitated, then stepped closer to the bed. "You shouldn't have to thank someone for doing what's right," she said softly. "But I've seen it too many times. Patients like you, dismissed because someone decided their pain didn't matter." Tasha's eyes welled with tears, but she blinked them away. "It's exhausting," she admitted, always having to fight to be heard. Paula reached out and placed a comforting hand on Tasha's shoulder. "You shouldn't have to fight alone." In the hospital cafeteria, Dr. Adams sat alone, staring at his untouched cup of coffee. His usual confidence had been replaced by a gnawing sense of guilt. He replayed the evening in his mind. from the moment he entered Tasha's room to the alarms that jolted him back. He couldn't shake the image of her pale face and labored breathing. Dr. Adams had always prided himself on his clinical efficiency, but now he questioned whether that efficiency had cost him his humanity. He thought about the training sessions on unconscious bias he had attended years ago. Back then, he had dismissed them as unnecessary, something for others to worry about. Now, the reality of his actions stared him in the face. A soft knock on the table brought him back to the present. Dr. Carter stood before him, her arms crossed and her expression unreadable. "We need to talk," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. Dr. Adams nodded, bracing himself for the inevitable conversation. "I reviewed Ms. Freeman's chart," Dr. Carter began. "There were clear signs of cardiac distress, high blood pressure, pallor, shortness of breath. Yet you dismissed her symptoms as anxiety." Dr. Adams opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Carter held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't just about you," she continued. "It's about a pattern I've noticed in this hospital, a pattern that puts certain patients at greater risk simply because of who they are. And I won't let it continue." Dr. Adams looked down at his coffee, unable to meet her gaze. "I didn't mean to." "That's the problem," Dr. Carter interrupted. "It's not about intent. It's about impact. And the impact of your decision nearly cost a woman her life tonight." As the night wore on, Tasha drifted in and out of sleep. Her dreams were fragmented, filled with flashes of the evening's events. The receptionist's dismissive glance, Dr. Adams' brusque tone. The moment she thought she might never wake up. When she awoke again, Paula was gone, replaced by Dr. Carter. The head doctor's presence was commanding, yet her expression was gentle. "Ms. Freeman," Dr. Carter began, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Tasha replied, though her voice carried a note of hesitation. "But I can't stop thinking about what happened." Dr. Carter nodded, her gaze steady. "You have every right to feel that way. What happened tonight shouldn't have happened." Tasha studied her, searching for sincerity in her words. Is Dr. Adams going to face any consequences?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "There will be an investigation, but I want you to know that we take this seriously. Your voice matters, and I won't let what happened tonight be swept under the rug." Tasha exhaled softly, a mixture of relief and lingering frustration. "It's not just about me," she said. "This happens to so many people, and most of them don't get a second chance." Dr. Carter's jaw tightened. "You're right, and that's why we need to do better." In the days that followed, the events of that night sparked a ripple effect throughout the hospital. Meetings were held, protocols were reviewed, and difficult conversations were initiated. For some, it was a wake-up call. For others, it was a painful reminder of the work still to be done. Tasha's story became a catalyst for change, not just for Crestview General, but for everyone who had been touched by her experience. And as she recovered, she found herself determined to ensure that her voice, and the voices of others like her, would never be ignored again. Breaking the silence. The sunlight spilling through the hospital windows seemed at odds with the tension that lingered in Tasha Freeman's hospital room. It was morning, but the weight of the previous night clung to her like a second skin. She lay still in the bed, her fingers brushing the smooth sheets as her mind replayed the events over and over. Every interaction, every word spoken or left unsaid, felt like pieces of a puzzle she was trying to assemble. Paula Hill entered the room, carrying a tray with breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and a small carton of orange juice. "Good morning, Miss Freeman," she said, her voice soft but warm. Tasha managed a small smile. "Morning." Paula placed the tray on the bedside table and adjusted the bed so Tasha could sit up. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Tasha replied, though the ache in her chest was more emotional than physical now. "Still trying to wrap my head around everything." Paula hesitated, her hand lingering on the tray. "It's a lot to process," she said gently. "If you want to talk, I'm here." Tasha nodded, but she wasn't ready to talk yet. not fully. Instead, she picked at the toast, her appetite dulled by the lingering frustration in her chest. Across the hospital, Dr. Carter was already at work. She stood in the conference room with her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the team of doctors and administrators seated around the table. Dr. Adams was among them, his face pale and drawn. "This isn't just about one incident," Dr. Carter began, her voice firm but measured. "It's about a pattern we can't afford to ignore." The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the projector displaying charts and data on the screen behind her. The numbers were stark. Patients of color were disproportionately dismissed or misdiagnosed compared to their white counterparts. Dr. Adams shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "We've all had long nights," he said, his tone defensive. "Sometimes mistakes happen." "This isn't just a mistake," Dr. Carter countered, her eyes narrowing. "It's negligence." Ms. Freeman's symptoms were classic signs of cardiac distress. If it weren't for Nurse Hill and the follow-up tests, we might be discussing her autopsy instead of her recovery. A murmur rippled through the room. Dr. Carter let the weight of her words settle before continuing. "We can't keep excusing this as fatigue or oversight. It's time we address the biases that influence our decisions, consciously or unconsciously." One of the younger doctors, Dr. Patel, raised his hand. "How do we fix this?" he asked, his voice tinged with both curiosity and concern. Dr. Carter nodded. "It starts with accountability and education. We need to implement mandatory training on implicit bias and patient advocacy, and we need to ensure that every patient, regardless of their background, is treated with the same urgency and care." Her word hung in the air, a challenge and a call to action. Back in Tasha's room, a new visitor arrived. Marcia Freeman, Tasha's sister, burst through the door with the energy of a hurricane. Her vibrant scarf trailed behind her, and her eyes were a mix of relief and fury. "Tasha," she exclaimed, rushing to the bed and wrapping her arms around her sister. "Are you okay? Why didn't you call me?" Tasha hugged her back, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I didn't want to worry you," she said softly. Marcia pulled back, her hands gripping Tasha's shoulders. "Worry me? You almost died, Tasha. And for what? Because some doctor didn't take you seriously." Paula, who had been tidying up the room, stepped forward. "It's true that there were mistakes," she said carefully. "But we caught it in time, and Tasha's stable now." Marcia's eyes narrowed. "Caught it in time. That doesn't make it okay. This shouldn't have happened in the first place." Tasha placed a hand on her sister's arm. "Marcia, please. I'm tired." Marcia sighed but sat down, her anger simmering beneath the surface. "We're not letting this go," she said. "We need to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." Tasha nodded. "I know. But I need to focus on getting better first." Later that afternoon, Dr. Carter visited Tasha's room. She knocked gently before entering, her expression a mixture of professionalism and empathy. "Ms. Freeman," she began, pulling up a chair beside the bed. "I wanted to check in on you and let you know what steps we're taking to address what happened." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "Steps? Like what?" Dr. Carter handed her a document outlining the hospital's plan for mandatory bias training, improved patient care protocols, and a review board for cases like hers. "This is just the beginning," she said. "But I want you to know we're committed to making changes." Tasha scanned the document, her expression unreadable. "This is good," she said finally. "But how do I know it'll actually happen? People say a lot of things when they're under pressure." Dr. Carter's jaw tightened. "You're right to be skeptical," she admitted. "But I'm personally overseeing these changes, and I'd like your input as we move forward." Tasha blinked, surprised. "My input?" "Yes," Dr. Carter said. "Your experience is invaluable. If you're willing, we'd like you to join our patient advisory board." Tasha hesitated. The idea of reliving her ordeal wasn't appealing, but the thought of helping others avoid the same fate resonated deeply. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Dr. Carter nodded. "That's all I can ask." As the sun set over the city, Tasha lay in bed, staring out the window. The events of the past day had shaken her, but they had also ignited something within her, a determination to make her voice heard. In the hallway, Paula and Dr. Carter exchanged a glance as they passed. Both women understood that change wouldn't happen overnight, but they were committed to the fight. And for the first time in a long time, Tasha felt a glimmer of hope. The rising voice. Tasha Freeman sat upright in her hospital bed, her fingers tracing the edge of the blanket as the faint hum of machines filled the silence. The physical pain had subsided, thanks to the steady drip of medication, but the emotional weight of the last 48 hours lingered like a shadow. She glanced at the clock. The hours felt both painfully slow and alarmingly fast, as if time itself couldn't decide how to move forward. Her sister, Marcia, was seated by the window, tapping furiously on her phone. "I've been researching," Marcia announced, not looking up. "This isn't just a one-time thing. There are articles, studies, entire reports about racial bias in healthcare." Tasha sighed. "I know, Marcia. I've lived it." Marcia set her phone down, her brow furrowed. "But this isn't just about you, Tasha. This is about everyone who's been dismissed, ignored, or worse. You have a platform now. You have a story. We need to do something with it." Tasha's gaze drifted to the window, where the city buzzed with its usual energy. The idea of sharing her story, of putting herself in the spotlight, felt daunting. But deep down, she knew Marcia was right. In another part of the hospital, Dr. Elaine Carter was deep in conversation with Paula Hill. The two women stood near the nurse's station, their voices low but urgent. "We need to get ahead of this," Dr. Carter said, her arms crossed. "If Ms. Freeman decides to go public, the hospital's reputation will be at stake." Paula frowned. "This isn't about the hospital's reputation," she said firmly. "This is about doing what's right." Dr. Carter nodded, her expression softening. "You're right. I just want to make sure that whatever changes we implement are genuine, not just for show." Paula glanced down the hall toward Tasha's room. "She's strong," Paula said, "but she's also tired. If we're asking her to help, we need to support her, not use her as a symbol." Dr. Carter looked thoughtful. "Agreed. Let's start by ensuring she knows we're committed." Later that afternoon, Tasha received another visitor. Dr. Patel, one of the younger physicians from the hospital, knocked softly before stepping inside. He looked nervous, his hands fidgeting with the pen in his pocket. "Ms. Freeman," he began, his voice hesitant, "I wanted to check in on you and apologize." Tasha raised an eyebrow. "Apologize? For what?" Dr. Patel shifted uncomfortably. "For not speaking up sooner. I was in the room when Dr. Adams dismissed your symptoms. I thought something was wrong, but I didn't say anything. I should have." Tasha studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable. "Why didn't you?" He hesitated, then sighed. "Fear of being wrong, of overstepping, of challenging someone more experienced than me." Tasha's gaze softened. "I appreciate your honesty," she said, "but fear doesn't save lives. Speaking up does." Dr. Patel nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I've learned that now," he said quietly, "and I won't let it happen again." Meanwhile, Marcia had taken it upon herself to start spreading the word about her sister's experience. She reached out to local journalists, community leaders, and advocacy groups, determined to shine a light on the systemic issues Tasha had faced. Her efforts caught the attention of a prominent health equity organization, which reached out to Tasha with an invitation to speak at an upcoming panel discussion on racial bias in healthcare. When Marcia presented the idea to Tasha, her sister hesitated. "I'm not a public speaker," Tasha said. "I don't even know what I'd say." Marcia placed a hand on her sister's shoulder. "You'd say the truth, Tasha. That's all you need to do." In the days leading up to the panel, Tasha found herself grappling with a mix of emotions: fear, anger, and a growing determination. She spent hours writing down her thoughts, recalling every moment of her hospital experience, and the countless instances before it when she'd been made to feel invisible. Paula stopped by one evening and found Tasha surrounded by crumpled pieces of paper. "Having trouble?" Paula asked, pulling up a chair. Tasha sighed. "I'm trying to figure out how to tell my story in a way that people will actually listen." Paula smiled. "Just speak from the heart. People will listen because your story matters." Tasha looked at Paula, her eyes searching. "Do you really believe that? That my voice can make a difference?" Paula's expression grew serious. "I know it can. You've already made a difference here. You're the reason Dr. Carter is pushing for change. And you're the reason I'll keep fighting for every patient who walks through those doors." The day of the panel arrived, and Tasha stood backstage, her heart pounding. The room beyond was packed with doctors, nurses, activists, and community members. Marcia stood beside her, offering words of encouragement. "You've got this," Marcia said. "Just take a deep breath and speak your truth." When Tasha stepped onto the stage, the applause was overwhelming. She took a moment to steady herself before approaching the microphone. "My name is Tasha Freeman," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves, "and I almost died because someone didn't believe me." The room fell silent as Tasha recounted her story, her words raw and powerful. She spoke not just of her experience at the hospital, but of the countless microaggressions and dismissals she'd faced throughout her life. She painted a vivid picture of the systemic barriers that prevented people like her from receiving the care they deserved. By the time she finished, the audience was on their feet, their applause thunderous. Tasha felt a surge of emotion, a mix of relief, pride, and hope. Back at the hospital, Dr. Carter watched a live stream of the panel from her office. She couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration for Tasha's bravery. She turned to Paula, who had joined her. "She's remarkable," Dr. Carter said. "She is," Paula agreed. "Now we have to make sure her story leads to real change." Dr. Carter nodded. "And it will. This is just the beginning." Tasha returned to her hospital room later that evening, exhausted but fulfilled. She found Paula waiting for her, a small smile on the nurse's face. "You were incredible," Paula said. "Thank you," Tasha replied, her voice soft. "I just hope it makes a difference." "It already has," Paula said firmly. "And it will continue to." Tasha lay back in her bed, a sense of calm washing over her. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen, heard, and empowered. And she knew this was just the start of something much bigger. The system exposed. The aftermath of Tasha Freeman's story sent ripples through Crestview General Hospital and beyond. The panel discussion had gone viral, with Tasha's raw and honest testimony resonating deeply across social media. People from all walks of life shared their own experiences of being dismissed, ignored, or mistreated in medical settings. The hashtag Believe Patients began trending, a rallying cry for systemic change. Tasha sat in her hospital room, scrolling through her phone, stunned by the outpouring of support. Messages flooded her inbox, words of encouragement, gratitude, and solidarity from strangers who saw their own struggles reflected in her story. But amid the flood of positivity were a few dissenting voices, questioning her motives and dismissing her as overreacting. "You can't focus on them," Marcia said, standing beside her sister. "Haters are going to hate. What matters is the conversation you've started." Tasha nodded, though the comments still stung. "I just hope it leads to something real," she said, "not just hashtags and headlines." Meanwhile, within the hospital, the fallout was unavoidable. Dr. Elaine Carter had called an emergency meeting with the board of directors. The usually composed and diplomatic head of emergency medicine was uncharacteristically direct. "This hospital's reputation is on the line," Dr. Carter began, her voice sharp. "But more importantly, so are our patients' lives. What happened to Ms. Freeman wasn't an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a broken system." The room was silent, the gravity of her words sinking in. Dr. Patel and Paula Hill were present, both of them nodding in agreement. Dr. Carter, one of the board members, an older man with silver hair, spoke up. What exactly are you proposing? Change doesn't come cheap or easy. I'm proposing a comprehensive overhaul of our patient care protocols, Dr. Carter replied. Mandatory bias training for all staff, more rigorous accountability measures, and a patient advocacy team that ensures voices like Ms. Freeman's aren't ignored. Another board member frowned. That sounds costly. Dr. Carter's gaze didn't waver. How costly would it have been if Ms. Freeman had died on our watch? Imagine the lawsuits, the media coverage, the damage to our reputation. Can we afford not to act? The room fell into a heavy silence. Outside the boardroom, Paula and Dr. Patel shared a quiet moment. Paula leaned against the wall, her arms crossed. "Do you think they'll actually do it?" she asked. Dr. Patel sighed. "They don't have a choice. The public backlash is already massive. If they don't act, it'll only get worse." Paula nodded. "It shouldn't take a scandal for people to do the right thing." "No," Dr. Patel agreed. "But maybe this is the push we needed." In her room, Tasha was visited by a journalist who had been following her story closely. Sarah Collins, a sharp-eyed woman in her 30s, arrived with a notepad and recorder in hand. "Ms. Freeman," Sarah began, settling into the chair beside the bed. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me. Your story has already made waves, but I want to dive deeper. Can you tell me more about what you experienced and how it shaped your view of the healthcare system?" Tasha hesitated, then began to speak. She recounted the small, subtle ways she had been dismissed, not just in the hospital but throughout her life. She talked about the pressure to prove her pain was real, the constant doubt she faced, and the exhaustion of fighting to be heard. "Do you think this will lead to change?" Sarah asked. "I hope so," Tasha replied. "But real change doesn't happen overnight. It takes persistence, accountability, and people willing to listen." That evening, Dr. Carter paid Tasha another visit. She carried a folder filled with documents outlining the proposed changes to hospital policy. "These are the first steps," Dr. Carter said, handing the folder to Tasha. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Tasha flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the proposals. "This looks good," she said, "but how do I know it won't just get buried under bureaucracy?" "You don't," Dr. Carter admitted, "but that's why I need people like you to hold us accountable. This isn't just about changing policies. It's about changing culture, and that takes time." Tasha looked up at her, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Then I'll make sure you keep your promise." The next day, Tasha was discharged from the hospital. As she stepped outside, the cool breeze hit her face, and she took a deep breath. Marcia was waiting for her car parked nearby. "You ready to go?" Marcia asked. Tasha nodded. "Ready." As they drove away, Tasha looked out the window, her mind racing with ideas. She wasn't just leaving the hospital. She was stepping into a new chapter, one where her voice would be a force for change. Back inside, Dr. Carter and Paula stood by the window, watching Tasha leave. "She's not done," Paula said, a small smile playing on her lips. "Neither are we," Dr. Carter replied. "This is just the beginning." The hospital's walls seemed to hum with a newfound energy. Change was coming, slow but inevitable, and Tasha Freeman's voice would be at its heart. The ripple effect. The ride home was quiet. Tasha stared out the window, watching the city roll by. Marcia glanced at her sister every now and then, sensing the weight of her thoughts but choosing not to press. Instead, she turned the radio to a soft instrumental station, letting the gentle melody fill the silence. When they arrived at Tasha's apartment, Marcia helped her inside, fussing over every little detail. "Are you sure you're okay? Do you need anything? Water? Tea?" Tasha chuckled softly, shaking her head. "Marcia, I'm fine. I promise. I just need to rest." Marcia sighed, sinking into the armchair across from Tasha. "I know you say that, but I can't help worrying. What if you hadn't made it to the hospital in time? What if?" Tasha reached out, placing a hand over her sister's. But I did, and I'm here. That's what matters. Marcia nodded, her eyes misting with unshed tears. It just makes me so angry, Tasha. You almost died because someone didn't take you seriously. How many other people don't get that second chance? Tasha's jaw tightened. Too many. That's why we have to keep pushing. For them. Meanwhile, at Crestview General Hospital, the staff was already feeling the impact of Tasha's story. The board had approved the first phase of Dr. Carter's proposed changes, a series of mandatory training sessions on implicit bias and patient advocacy. Flyers announcing the sessions were posted in break rooms and hallways, accompanied by an email from Dr. Carter emphasizing the importance of attendance. Dr. Patel sat in his office, reviewing patient charts, but his thoughts kept drifting to Tasha. Her story had shaken him, forcing him to confront his own hesitations and biases. He resolved to be better, not just for his patients, but for himself. Paula Hill, too, found herself invigorated. Her colleagues noticed the change, the way she spoke up more during meetings, the determination in her voice when advocating for her patients. She wasn't afraid to challenge doctors anymore, even when it meant uncomfortable conversations. That evening, Tasha sat at her kitchen table, staring at her laptop. The email from the Health Equity Organization inviting her to join their advisory board sat open on the screen. She had been thinking about it all day, weighing the pros and cons. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention away. It was a text from Paula. Just wanted to check in. Hope you're resting and feeling better. Don't forget, you've already made a difference, and you'll keep making one. Tasha smiled, her fingers hovering over the keyboard before she replied. Thank you, Paula. I'll keep going. For all of us. She took a deep breath and clicked reply on the email, typing her acceptance. If her voice could help even one more person avoid what she'd been through, it would be worth it. Across town, Dr. Carter was finishing up another long day. She sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of papers and charts, but she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She thought about Tasha, about Paula, about all the patients whose stories had been silenced. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but it was happening. Her phone buzzed with a notification. An article about the hospital's new initiatives, featuring a photo of Tasha and a quote from her panel speech. Your voice can save your life, but only if someone listens. It's time for the system to listen. Dr. Carter smiled, closing her laptop. For the first time in years, she felt hopeful. The next morning, Tasha woke up to find her story splashed across the front page of the local newspaper. The headline read, "One woman's voice sparks change in healthcare." She stared at the article, her heart pounding. It felt surreal to see her face and words in print, to know that people were paying attention. Her phone buzzed again, this time, a call from Marcia. "Have you seen it?" Marcia asked excitedly. "You're everywhere, Tasha. This is just the beginning." Tasha laughed softly. "I've seen it. It's a lot." "It's incredible," Marcia corrected. "And you deserve it." As the call ended, Tasha set her phone down and leaned back in her chair. She thought about the journey ahead, the challenges, the resistance, the moments of doubt. But she also thought about the lives she might touch, the people she might inspire to speak up. And in that moment, she knew she was ready to face whatever came next. The new standard. It had been 6 months since Tasha Freeman's experience at Crestview General Hospital set off a chain reaction of change. The hospital was now in the spotlight, not for its failures, but for how it was addressing them. The once quiet corridors now buzzed with conversations about bias training, patient advocacy, and a renewed commitment to equity in healthcare. Tasha sat in a brightly lit conference room at the city's Health Equity Organization headquarters. Around the table sat doctors, nurses, administrators, and community leaders. Tasha was the only patient representative, but she carried her role with quiet determination. "Ms. Freeman," the facilitator said, "would you like to start today's discussion?" Tasha nodded, her fingers brushing against the edges of the notes she had prepared. "I want to talk about what it means to feel invisible," she began. "For too long, Patients like me have had to fight to be seen and heard. That shouldn't be our burden. It's the system that needs to change, not us." The room was silent, her words cutting through the air like a blade. Dr. Carter, who had joined the advisory board as a hospital representative, leaned forward. "You're absolutely right, Ms. Freeman. That's why we're implementing new patient-centered protocols at Crestview. Every staff member is required to undergo training, and we've hired patient advocates to act as liaisons between patients and medical teams." Tasha nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's a good start, but we need to ensure these changes are monitored. Policies mean nothing if they aren't enforced." Dr. Carter met her gaze and smiled faintly. "Agreed." Later that week, Tasha visited Crestview for the first time since her discharge. The lobby was familiar but felt different. New posters adorned the walls, featuring the slogan, "Every voice matters." A nurse at the front desk greeted her warmly, asking if she needed assistance. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. Tasha was there to observe a bias training session for hospital staff. She sat in the back of the room, watching as Dr. Patel led the discussion. The once nervous doctor had grown into his role as an advocate for change, speaking with confidence and conviction. "Bias isn't just about overt actions," Dr. Patel said. "It's about the subtle ways we dismiss or overlook people based on assumptions. We have to challenge those assumptions every day." At one point, Dr. Patel invited Tasha to share her story. She hesitated, feeling the weight of the room's attention, but then stood up. "I'm here today because someone finally listened," she began. "But it shouldn't have taken alarms and chaos for my voice to matter. I hope that what we're doing here will ensure no one else has to go through what I did." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Tasha felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of pride and hope. After the session, Paula Hill found Tasha in the cafeteria. The two women hugged tightly, their bond stronger than ever. "You've become quite the advocate," Paula said, her eyes shining with pride. "I've had some good role models," Tasha replied with a smile. Paula laughed softly, shaking her head. "You've always had it in you. It just took the right moment to bring it out." As weeks turned into months, Tasha's voice continued to grow. She spoke at conferences, wrote op-eds for major publications, and even testified before a congressional committee on healthcare reform. Her story became a catalyst for a national conversation about bias in medicine. But it wasn't just about speaking up. Tasha made it a point to listen too. She met with patients from all walks of life, hearing their stories and amplifying their voices. She worked closely with advocacy groups to develop resources and tools for patients to navigate the healthcare system more confidently. Back at Crestview, Dr. Carter and her team worked tirelessly to sustain the momentum. They partnered with local universities to conduct research on healthcare disparities and launched a mentorship program to support young medical professionals from underrepresented backgrounds. Dr. Adams, who had initially resisted the changes, had undergone his own transformation. He approached Tasha one day after a meeting, his demeanor humbled. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly, "not just for what happened, but for the way I've approached my work. You opened my eyes, and I'm committed to being better." Tasha studied him for a moment, then extended her hand. "It's never too late to change," she said simply. On the one-year anniversary of Tasha's hospital stay, Crestview held a community event to celebrate the progress made and recommit to its mission of equitable care. Tasha was the keynote speaker, standing on a stage before an audience of hundreds. "This isn't just my story," she said, her voice strong. "It's the story of everyone who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or dismissed. It's a reminder that change is possible, but it requires all of us to stand together and demand better." As the crowd erupted in applause, Tasha felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't thought possible. Her journey had been difficult, but it had led to something meaningful, something that would outlast her. And as she stepped off the stage, surrounded by friends, allies, and strangers who had been inspired by her story, Tasha knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt certain they were on the right path. Together, a new legacy. As the applause faded and the crowd began to disperse, Tasha Freeman stepped down from the stage, feeling the weight of the moment settle over her. The warm glow of the event lights reflected in her eyes, and she smiled faintly, knowing this was not the end of her journey, but a significant milestone. Marcia rushed forward, pulling her into a tight hug. "You were amazing up there, Tasha," she said, her voice filled with pride. "You've started something incredible." Tasha pulled back, her gaze soft but determined. "We've started something, Marcia. I couldn't have done any of this without you." They stood together for a moment, watching as attendees mingled, discussing the initiatives and ideas sparked by the event. Tasha caught glimpses of doctors and nurses exchanging ideas, patient advocates connecting with community leaders, and even Dr. Adams deep in conversation with a young medical student. Dr. Elaine Carter approached Tasha, her expression warm but reflective. "You've changed this place," she said, "and not just the hospital. You've changed the way we think about care, about trust, about listening." Tasha shook her head humbly. "I didn't do it alone. People like you and Paula made this possible." Dr. Carter smiled. "True, but you were the spark. Sometimes that's all it takes to ignite something bigger than any of us." Paula joined them, her clipboard tucked under her arm. "You're leaving a legacy here, Tasha," she said. "One that'll outlast all of us." Tasha looked between the two women, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me when it mattered most." As the evening wound down, Tasha found herself outside the hospital, staring at the illuminated Crestview General Hospital sign. The building seemed different now, no longer a place of fear and frustration, but one of hope and progress. Marcia joined her, slipping an arm around her shoulders. "What's next for you, big sister?" she asked. Tasha smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "Oh, I have a few ideas." In the following weeks, Tasha's influence continued to grow. She launched a foundation dedicated to patient advocacy, providing resources, workshops, and funding for programs that supported equitable healthcare. The foundation partnered with hospitals, schools, and grassroots organizations to create lasting change. One of her first initiatives was the Freeman Fellowship, a scholarship program for underrepresented students pursuing careers in medicine. The fellowship aimed to address systemic disparities by ensuring that future generations of healthcare providers reflected the communities they served. Crestview General became a model for other hospitals across the country. Dr. Carter's initiatives, once met with skepticism, were now studied and replicated nationwide. Paula was promoted to lead the hospital's newly established patient advocacy department, where she trained nurses to be frontline advocates for their patients. Even Dr. Adams, once a symbol of the problem, became a vocal supporter of the reforms. He often spoke about his transformation, using his mistakes as a teaching tool for others. Years later, Tasha stood on another stage, this time addressing a national healthcare conference. Her voice was steady, her presence commanding. "We've come a long way," she said, "but the work isn't over. Healthcare isn't just about medicine. It's about trust, respect, and humanity. Every patient deserves to feel seen, heard, and valued. Let's keep building a system that reflects those values." The audience erupted in applause, a standing ovation that left Tasha momentarily speechless. As she stepped back from the microphone, she caught sight of Marcia, Paula, and Dr. Carter in the crowd, their faces beaming with pride. That night, as Tasha returned home, she sat by her window, gazing out at the city lights. The journey had been arduous, marked by pain, struggle, and moments of doubt. But it had also been transformative, filled with purpose and connection. For the first time in a long time, Tasha felt a deep sense of peace. She had taken her pain and turned it into power, her voice into a catalyst for change. And as she closed her eyes, she knew that this was the beginning of a legacy that would endure long after her. Her story had become more than just her own. It was a movement, a call to action, a promise for a better tomorrow. and that was more than enough.